In the dim glow of a lonely train carriage racing through the misty English countryside, Miss Marple glanced up from her knitting and witnessed something impossible. A brutal murder happening before her eyes in the lighted window of a passing train. A woman's face twisted in terror as strong hands tightened around her throat. But when the old lady raised the alarm, nobody believed her. Not the skeptical police, not the doubtful guard, and certainly not the respectable residents of the grand house overlooking the railway line. What began as one shocking glimpse on the last train from Market Basing slowly unraveled into a chilling tale of greed, rage, and cold-blooded murder hidden on a quiet embankment. Only the gentle, sharp-eyed Miss Marple, with her knitting needles and quiet wisdom, could piece together the deadly truth that everyone else wanted to bury forever. Chapter 1. The last train from Market Basing. It was a raw October evening, with a thin mist rising from the fields and curling round the hedges like a stealthy intruder. Miss Jane Marple sat in the corner seat of a first-class carriage on the 9.15 train from Market Basing, her hands moving steadily over a half-finished shawl of pale blue wool. The click-click of her knitting needles was the only sound in the compartment, for the train was almost empty. She had spent a most agreeable afternoon with her old school friend Letitia Carstairs, discussing the sad decline of good border plants and the outrageous price of coal. Now, pleasantly tired and looking forward to her own fireside, Miss Marple was returning to Melford Cross on the last train of the evening. The carriage was old-fashioned, with faded green upholstery and dim electric lights that cast soft shadows. At the little wayside station of Lower Stoke, the train halted for a minute or two. The door opened and two passengers entered. The first was a tall, heavily built man in a dark overcoat with an astrakhan collar. His face was partly hidden by the brim of a soft felt hat, but Miss Marple noticed a small, well-trimmed military moustache and a pair of strong, rather coarse hands. He carried a leather dispatch case and moved with the air of a man accustomed to command. Behind him came a woman of middle age, neatly but not fashionably dressed in a dark green coat with a collar of rather worn brown fur. Her face was pale and anxious. She clutched a small handbag as though it contained something precious. She sat down opposite the man, not beside him, and immediately turned her head towards the window. Though there was nothing to be seen but the drifting mist and the dim lights of the platform, the guard blew his whistle. The train gave a jerk and moved forward into the night, gathering speed as it left the lights of Lower Stoke behind. For some time there was silence. Miss Marple continued her knitting, occasionally glancing up with mild interest at her fellow travellers. The man had taken out a newspaper, but did not seem to be reading it. The woman sat rigid, her gloved hands folded tightly in her lap. Once or twice Miss Marple thought she heard a small, nervous sigh. The train rattled on through the deepening darkness. They were approaching the long stretch of line that ran through the wooded cutting near Abbott's Wood, where the embankment rose steeply on one side and fell away on the other. Here the line ran parallel for nearly half a mile with the main northern route before the two tracks diverged again. Suddenly, from out of the mist, another train appeared, running in the same direction on the adjacent line. It was the 9.28 slow train from London, crowded with passengers returning home. For a few moments the two trains ran side by side, their windows brightly lit, so close that one could see clearly into the opposite carriages. Miss Marple happened to be looking directly across at that instant. What she saw made her knitting needles pause in mid-air. In the window opposite, no more than 6 feet away, the tall man with the military moustache had risen to his feet. His hands, those strong, coarse hands, were fastened tightly round the throat of the woman in the green coat. Her eyes were starting from her head in pure terror. Her mouth was open in a silent scream. For one endless second, the horrifying tableau was perfectly clear in the yellow light of the carriage lamps. Then the other train began to draw ahead. The windows slid past one after another until the dreadful scene vanished into the night as suddenly as it had appeared. Miss Marple sat very still. Her heart was beating faster than was comfortable for a lady of her years, but her mind remained clear and sharp. She had seen what she had seen. There could be no mistake. With a steady hand, she reached up and pulled the communication cord. The long, piercing shriek of the emergency brake filled the night as the train began to slow down with a grinding of wheels and a series of violent jolts. Chapter 2. Nobody believes an old lay-dial emergency cord had done its work with dramatic effect. The 9.15 train from Market Basing shuddered to a protesting halt in the middle of a desolate stretch of line. Halfway through the deep cutting beyond Abbott's Wood, steam hissed from the engine, and the sudden silence that followed seemed almost unnaturally complete, broken only by the distant hoot of an owl and the faint rustle of wind in the trees on the embankment. Miss Jane Marple remained seated, her knitting folded neatly in her lap, her expression one of calm determination. She had pulled the cord without hesitation, and now she waited with the patience that only a lifetime of observing human folly could bestow. In her mind's eye she could still see that dreadful picture, the man's powerful hands locked round the woman's throat, the woman's face convulsed with terror, the whole scene illuminated for those few fatal seconds by the lights of the parallel train. The guard appeared at the carriage door within 2 minutes, red-faced and breathing hard. He was a stout, middle-aged man with a walrus moustache and the air of one who had dealt with every variety of foolish passenger in his time. "Now then, madam," he began, rather severely, "what's all this about? You can't go pulling the communication cord for nothing, you know. There's a £5 fine for improper use, and, I assure you, it was not improper," said Miss Marple in her gentlest voice. "I have just witnessed a murder." The guard stared at her. "A what, madam?" "A murder," repeated Miss Marple clearly. "In the train running parallel to ours. A man was strangling a woman. I saw it quite distinctly as the two trains drew level." The guard's expression changed from annoyance to incredulity, and then to something approaching pity. He glanced at the other two passengers, who were now looking thoroughly alarmed. The tall man in the dark overcoat had lowered his newspaper and was regarding Miss Marple with a mixture of surprise and faint amusement. The woman in the green coat sat very still, her hands still tightly clasped, her eyes fixed on the floor. "Perhaps madam was dozing," suggested the guard kindly. "These late trains can make one drowsy, and with the mist and the lights from the other train." "I was not dozing," said Miss Marple firmly. "I was wide awake and knitting." The man had a small military moustache and very strong hands. The woman wore a green coat with a brown fur collar. She looked terrified. "You must stop the train properly and search both carriages and the line." The guard exchanged a look with the tall man, who gave a slight shrug as if to say, "What can one do with these elderly ladies?" "Very well, madam," said the guard with heavy patience. "I'll make a note of it. But we can't hold the train up indefinitely. We're already running late. And there's the mail to consider. If you'd care to give me your name and address." Miss Marple gave both with quiet dignity. "Miss Jane Marple, of Melford Cross, and I must insist that the matter is reported at once to the proper authorities." The guard scribbled in his notebook, muttered something about nervous old ladies, and departed, slamming the door rather more loudly than was necessary. The train gave a jerk and began to move forward again, slowly at first, then gathering speed once more into the night. The tall man folded his newspaper with a crisp sound. "A most distressing experience for you, madam," he remarked in a smooth, cultivated voice. "Trains at night can play strange tricks on the imagination. I once thought I saw a ghost on the Scotch Express, turned out to be nothing but a reflection in the glass." Miss Marple looked at him steadily. "It was no reflection, sir. It was a murder. I am quite certain of it." The woman opposite gave a small, involuntary gasp and turned her face further towards the window. The man smiled politely, but his eyes were watchful. "Perhaps you would like me to fetch you a glass of water from the attendant," he suggested. "No, thank you," said Miss Marple. "I am perfectly well, but I shall certainly repeat my statement when we reach the next station." The remainder of the journey passed in uncomfortable silence. The woman in green kept her eyes averted, and the tall man returned to his newspaper, though Miss Marple noticed that he turned the pages rather too regularly to be actually reading. At last, the train drew into Melford Cross Station, 23 minutes late. The platform was dimly lit by gas lamps, and a thin drizzle had begun to fall. A young constable in uniform was waiting near the barrier, summoned no doubt by the guard's telephone message from the previous stop. Miss Marple stepped down carefully, refusing the tall man's offer of assistance with a courteous smile. The guard was already speaking to the constable in a low voice, gesturing towards her with an expressive shrug. The constable approached, notebook in hand. He was a fresh-faced young man, Detective Sergeant William Lake, recently transferred from a larger town and still inclined to treat country matters with a certain tolerant amusement. Miss Marple, he said politely, I understand you reported seeing something unusual on the train. Not something unusual, Sergeant, corrected Miss Marple. A murder. A man strangling a woman in the carriage of the parallel train. It happened when our train and the 9.28 from London ran side by side near Abbott's Wood. I can describe both persons quite clearly. Sergeant Lake listened attentively as she repeated her account in precise detail. The man's height and build, the military mustache, the woman's green coat and fur collar, the expression of terror on her face. He wrote it all down without interruption. When she had finished, he closed his notebook and gave her a reassuring smile. We'll certainly look into it, Miss Marple, but you must understand that two trains passing each other at speed in the dark, well, it's easy for the eye to be deceived. Reflections, shadows, even the movement of the carriages themselves can create all sorts of illusions, and no one else in your carriage seems to have noticed anything. The other passengers were not looking in the right direction, said Miss Marple, and one of them, the gentleman in the dark overcoat, appeared rather anxious to suggest that I had imagined the whole thing. Sergeant Lake's expression remained professionally neutral. We'll make full inquiries at the other stations and with the crew of the 9.28. If there's any truth in the matter, a body will turn up or a passenger will be reported missing. In the meantime, may I arrange for someone to see you safely home? That is very kind, said Miss Marple, but quite unnecessary. I have only a short walk, and the night air will do me good. She set off through the drizzle, her umbrella raised, her mind busy with the details she had observed. The man's hands had been unusually large and powerful. The woman had worn a wedding ring on her left hand. Miss Marple had noticed the brief glint of gold, and there had been something familiar about the man's profile, though she could not yet place it. By the time she reached her neat little house in Melford Cross, the rain had grown heavier. She lit the gas in the sitting room, poked up the fire that her daily help had left banked, and sat down with a cup of hot cocoa. Her knitting lay untouched on the table. People are so very reluctant to believe unpleasant things, she murmured to herself, especially when they concern an elderly spinster who knits. But I know what I saw, and if no one else will act, then I suppose I must. The next morning dawned grey and damp. Miss Marple breakfasted early on toast and marmalade, then walked down to the local police station. Sergeant Lake was already at his desk, looking rather tired. Good morning, Miss Marple, he said with determined cheerfulness. I've made the usual inquiries. The 9.28 arrived at its destination without incident. No passenger reported missing. No disturbance noted by the guard or any of the other travellers. We've checked the line near Abbott's Wood. Nothing unusual found on the tracks or embankment. I'm afraid it really does look as though you were mistaken. Miss Marple sat down on the hard wooden chair opposite him. I'm not mistaken, Sergeant. The woman was murdered. Her body may have been removed at one of the stops, or perhaps thrown from the train in a place where it would not be immediately noticed. Have you considered the possibility that the murderer left the train at Abbott's Wood Halt? It is only a request stop, and very little used at night. Sergeant Lake rubbed his chin. We did think of that, but the Halt was unmanned last night, and no one remembers any passenger alighting there. Look here, Miss Marple, you're a lady of excellent reputation, and I don't doubt your good faith for a moment. But these things happen especially to people who have been reading too many sensational novels. I do not read sensational novels, said Miss Marple mildly. I prefer a good detective story when I read at all, but my observations are based on life, not fiction. In my long experience, Sergeant, when someone is strangled in a train carriage, The body does not simply vanish into thin air. It must be somewhere, and someone, somewhere, will soon be reported missing. Sergeant Lakeside. We'll keep the matter open, of course, but I must ask you not to discuss it widely. Rumors in a small place like this can cause unnecessary alarm. Miss Marple rose to leave. I quite understand, Sergeant, but I shall continue to think about it. One learns a great deal from small things. The way people look, the way they speak, the little inconsistencies that others overlook. Human nature is very much the same everywhere. You know. She walked home through the wet streets, stopping briefly at the post office to buy stamps and exchange a few words with the postmistress, Mrs. Pollitt, who was a mine of local information. Anything in the London papers this morning? Asked Miss Marple casually. Nothing out of the ordinary, dear, said Mrs. Pollitt, though there was a paragraph about a lady's companion who hasn't been seen since yesterday. Went off to visit relatives or something. But these modern young women are always rushing about. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. A lady's companion, you say? Oh, just a small notice. Name of Stokes or something. But I expect she turn up. They usually do. Miss Marple thanked her and continued on her way. Back in her sitting room, took out her knitting once more. But her fingers moved mechanically while her mind turned over the events of the previous night. Nobody believed an old lady. That was the way of the world. The police were kind. The guard had been dismissive. The other passengers skeptical. Yet the picture in the lighted window remained vivid and terrible in her memory. She would wait. She would watch. And if, as she fully expected, a body or a missing person came to light, then perhaps someone would listen to what an elderly spinster from Melford Cross had to say. For Miss Marple had no intention of letting the matter rest. In her quiet, determined way, she had already begun to form a plan. Chapter 3. The house by the railway. Days that followed were deceptively quiet in Melford Cross. The drizzle gave way to pale autumn sunshine, and the village resumed its usual rhythm of morning deliveries, afternoon teas, and gentle gossip exchanged over garden fences. Miss Marple, however, found no such tranquillity in her own mind. The image of the woman's terrified face in the lighted carriage window returned to her at unexpected moments, while she was arranging chrysanthemums in a vase, while she was dusting the china cabinet, even while she sat in the parish church listening to a rather tedious sermon on charity. On the third morning of the incident, she decided that further passive waiting would achieve nothing. She put on her second-best coat, the one with the velvet collar, took her umbrella as a precaution against the changeable weather, and caught the 11 o'clock omnibus to the small market town of Chilton. Some 7 miles distant, Chilton was a larger, busier place than Melford Cross, with a fine old market square, several substantial houses, and, most importantly for Miss Marple's purpose, the district offices of the railway company. She made her way there directly after a light lunch at the Copper Kettle Tea Room, where the waitress remembered her from previous visits and brought her the usual pot of China tea, without being asked. The railway offices occupied a red brick building behind the station. Miss Marple presented herself at the inquiry counter with such a sweet, slightly bewildered air that the clerk, a thin young man with spectacles, felt obliged to be particularly helpful. I wonder, she began, if it would be possible to see a copy of last Tuesday's timetable, the one for the evening trains. I am trying to trace the exact time at which two particular trains would have been running side by side. It is for a small puzzle I am composing for my nephew, who writes books. You know, the clerk, flattered by the notion that he might assist a literary endeavour, produced the timetable readily. Miss Marple studied it with careful attention. The 9.15 from Market, Basing and the 9.28 slow train from London ran parallel for almost exactly 3/4 of a mile in the deep, cutting beyond Abbott's Wood. The timing fitted perfectly with what she had observed. Such an interesting line, she remarked conversationally. It passes so close to Colonel Harrington's property at Abbott's Wood. I believe the house commands quite a view of the railway. The clerk nodded. Oh yes, ma'am. The Colonel has complained more than once about the noise. especially the night goods trains. But the line was there long before the house was built, so there's not much he can do. Miss Marple folded the timetable and slipped it into her handbag. Colonel Eustace Harrington, is it not? A military gentleman, I think, retired, yes, lives there with his housekeeper and a manservant. His nephew and niece visit from time to time. Rather a lonely place, if you ask me, stuck up on that hill with the woods behind and the railway below. Miss Marple thanked the young man warmly and left the office. Instead of returning immediately to the omnibus stop, she walked the short distance to the post office, where she knew the postmistress, Mrs. Pollitt's sister-in-law, kept an even sharper eye on local affairs than her relative in Melford Cross. Mrs. Pollitt the younger was a plump, cheerful woman with a fondness for bright scarves. She greeted Miss Marple like an old friend. "Fancy seeing you in Chiltern, Miss Marple. What brings you over on such a fresh day?" "A little shopping and a visit to the railway offices," said Miss Marple. "I was admiring the view from the hill near Abbot's Wood. Such a striking house the Colonel has there. I suppose he must be quite comfortable in his retirement." Mrs. Pollitt leaned across the counter, lowering her voice, although there was no one else in the shop. "Comfortable enough in money, I dare say, but not the easiest of gentlemen. Quick temper, especially since his wife died 5 years ago. Keeps very much to himself. The housekeeper, Mrs. Bryce, is a sensible woman, but she has her hands full. And then there's the nephew, Mr. Gerald Harrington, handsome young man, always smiling, but they say he's rather too fond of the card tables in London. And the niece, Miss Sylvia, she came down last week, quite unexpectedly. Pretty girl, fair hair, but looking rather peaky, if you ask me. Nervous type. Miss Marple's needles would have been clicking rapidly had she been knitting. Instead she merely nodded with mild interest. How very sad when families are not quite happy together. One hears such stories. Was there not some talk about the Colonel's sister-in-law, a Mrs. Vandermeyer, I believe, a widow with a good deal of money. Double quotes. Mrs. Pollitt's eyes brightened. You are well informed, Miss Marple. Yes, Mrs. Vandermeyer rich as Croesus, they say, lives mostly in London or on the Riviera. There was some quarrel about money a few months back. The Colonel felt she ought to help the family more, especially young Gerald, who's always short. But Mrs. Vandermeyer is close with her purse, except when it comes to her own companion. A Miss Stokes, I think, been with her 4 years. They say she's to get a nice little legacy when the time comes. Miss Marple purchased a book of stamps. She did not particularly need and lingered a few more minutes in pleasant conversation before taking her leave. As she walked back towards the omnibus stop, her mind was busy arranging these small fragments of information into a pattern. A lonely house overlooking the railway, a colonel with a quick temper and financial worries, a nephew who needed money, a niece who seemed nervous, and a rich widow's companion who had, according to the brief newspaper paragraph, not been seen for several days. By the time the omnibus deposited her back in Melford Cross, the afternoon was well advanced. Miss Marple went straight to her sitting room, drew out a sheet of notepaper, and wrote a short but carefully worded letter to her nephew Raymond West. Raymond, with his literary connections and wide acquaintance in London, would be able to discover more about Mrs. Vandermeyer and her household without arousing undue curiosity. She posted the letter herself at the village post office, then returned home to prepare a simple supper of scrambled eggs and stewed apples. While the eggs were cooking, she stood at the window looking out over her neat garden towards the distant line of hills where Abbott's would lay hidden. The house by the railway, she thought, held the key. She was almost certain of it, but certainty was not proof, and proof would be difficult to obtain when the police had already decided that an elderly lady had merely suffered a momentary delusion. Miss Marple sighed gently, turned down the gas under the saucepan, and sat down to eat. Tomorrow, she decided, she would pay a call at Abbot's Wood. A small contribution to the church restoration fund would provide an excellent excuse. Colonel Harrington might be difficult, but even difficult gentlemen sometimes revealed more than they intended when confronted with a harmless old lady who admired their roses and asked innocent questions about trains. She smiled to herself. A small, private smile. Human nature was remarkably consistent. Greed, fear, temper, and the desperate desire to appear respectable. These things had tripped up cleverer people than Colonel Eustace Harrington and Miss Marple. Though she looked the picture of a gentle spinster whose greatest excitement was her knitting, had no intention of allowing a murderer to escape justice simply because nobody believed an old lady. Chapter 4. The missing companion. Following morning brought a thin envelope with a London postmark. Miss Marple opened it at the breakfast table while sipping her coffee. Raymond West's reply was characteristically brief and to the point, written in his neat, rather dashing hand. My dear Aunt Jane, your letter intrigued me. Mrs. Vandermeyer is indeed a wealthy widow, rather flamboyant, fond of the Riviera and of younger admirers. Her companion for the past 6 years has been a Miss Harriet Stokes, a quiet, capable woman of 42. Recently, there has been talk in the household of a new will, of which Miss Stokes figures more generously than the family expected. Mrs. Vandermeyer quarrelled quite violently with her brother-in-law, Colonel Harrington, over money last spring. She accused him of trying to influence her against her better judgment. Miss Stokes left the house in Lowndes Square on the afternoon of the 15th, saying she was going to visit a relative in the country. She has not been seen since. The police have been informed, but so far treat it as a voluntary disappearance. Mrs. Vandermeyer is currently in Nice and has expressed mild annoyance rather than alarm. If this connects with your mysterious train incident, do be careful. These matters have a way of becoming unpleasant. Your affectionate nephew, Raymond. Miss Marple read the letter twice, then folded it carefully and placed it in the small drawer of her writing desk, where she kept certain private papers. The date fitted exactly. The 15th was the day of the last train from Market Basing. Miss Harriet Stokes had left London wearing, according to the description now circulating, a dark green coat with a collar of brown fur. She sat for some minutes looking out at her garden, where the last roses were shedding their petals. Then she rose, put on her hat and gloves, and set out for Abbott's Wood. The walk was longer than she usually undertook, but the day was fine and the exercise would do her good, she told herself. The road climbed gently between high hedges until it reached the edge of the wood. From there a private drive, well gravelled, led up to the house. Abbott's Wood was a solid, square-built residence of grey stone, with tall chimneys and windows that stared down at the railway line and in the valley below. In silver ribbon dot, Miss Marple approached the front door and rang the bell. It was answered after a short interval by a middle-aged woman in a neat dark dress, presumably the housekeeper. Mrs. Bryce, good morning, said Miss Marple pleasantly. I wonder if Colonel Harrington could spare me a few moments. I am collecting subscriptions for the restoration of the roof of St. Peter's in Melford Cross, such a worthy cause, and we are hoping that gentlemen of the neighbourhood will feel inclined to support it. Mrs. Bryce looked doubtful. The Colonel is not very fond of callers, madam, but if you would step inside, I will inquire. She showed Miss Marple into a sombre drawing room, furnished with heavy Victorian pieces and a number of rather gloomy oil paintings of hearses and military scenes. A large window overlooked the garden and, beyond it, the steep embankment and the railway. After a few minutes the door opened and Colonel Eustace Harrington entered. He was a tall, heavily built man with a florid complexion, a bristling grey moustache, and eyes that looked as though they were accustomed to command rather than to converse. He wore tweeds that had seen better days. Miss Marple, he barked, never heard of you. What's all this about church roofs? Can't a man have peace in his own house? Miss Marple smiled apologetically. I do apologize for disturbing you, Colonel, but the roof is in a most shocking state, and every contribution, however small, is gratefully received. Perhaps you would care to see the view from your garden. I have heard it is quite famous for the roses. The Colonel grunted, but the mention of roses appeared to soften him slightly. He led the way through French windows onto a wide terrace. The garden sloped down towards the railway cutting. From where they stood the line was clearly visible, the two sets of rails running parallel for some distance before diverging. Trains must be rather noisy at night, observed Miss Marple. gazing down with apparent innocence. "Damn nuisance," growled the Colonel. "Especially the expresses. Wake a man from a sound sleep. I've written to the company more than once, indeed. I believed your trains run side by side, just here for a short stretch. It must be quite a sight when they pass one another after dark. All the lighted windows flashing by." Colonel Harrington gave her a sharp look. "What's that to do with church roofs?" "Nothing at all," said Miss Marple mildly. "Merely an observation. One notices so many little things when one grows old." At that moment a young man came at the corner of the house. He was tall and good-looking, with smooth dark hair and a ready smile that seemed a little too practiced. "Uncle, I thought I heard voices," he said. "Ah, a visitor. How do you do? I'm Gerald Harrington." Miss Marple shook the extended hand. "Miss Jane Marple. I was just admiring your uncle's garden, and the view of the railway is so interesting." Gerald's smile remained fixed, but his eyes flickered for the briefest instant towards the embankment. "Yes, rather dramatic, isn't it? Especially at night, when the trains rush past. One feels quite cut off from the world up here." A young woman appeared behind him, fair-haired, pretty in a delicate way, but with shadows under her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights. She was introduced as Miss Sylvia Harrington, the Colonel's niece. Miss Marple was speaking of the trains. "Sylvia," said Gerald lightly, "you remember how they thunder along just below the garden?" Sylvia gave a small start. Yes, of course. They are rather frightening sometimes." Her voice was low, and she did not meet Miss Marple's gaze. Miss Marple accepted a cup of tea when it was offered, though the Colonel made it clear he had no intention of subscribing more than a token guinea to the church fund. While they sat on the terrace, she observed the three members of the household with her usual quiet attention. Colonel Harrington drank his tea noisily and complained about the government, the railways, and the younger generation. Gerald kept the conversation flowing with easy charm, telling several amusing anecdotes about London life. Sylvia spoke little, twisting a handkerchief in her lap and starting visibly whenever a distant whistle sounded from the valley. Once, when the Colonel went inside to fetch his checkbook, Miss Marple turned to the young people. "It must be rather lonely for you both here," she said gently, "especially for a young lady. Do you often have visitors from London?" Sylvia flushed. Not very often. My auntie, that is, Mrs. Vandermeyer, sometimes sends her companion down with messages, but she hasn't come recently." "Miss Harriet Stokes?" asked Miss Marple, as though the name had just occurred to her. Both Gerald and Sylvia looked at her sharply. "You know Miss Stokes?" asked Gerald, his tone carefully casual. "Only by name," said Miss Marple. "I believe she is missing. Such a worrying thing. One reads about these disappearances in the papers. A lady's companion leaving London and never arriving at her destination. The police, I understand, are quite baffled." Sylvia's handkerchief twisted tighter. Gerald laughed, but the sound was not entirely natural. "These things usually turn out to be nothing," he said. "Miss Stokes probably decided to take a little holiday on her own account. Women do, you know." "Perhaps," said Miss Marple. "Yet it seems strange that she should choose the very night when two trains run so close together through this quiet stretch of country." Colonel Harrington returned at that moment with a cheque for 1 guinea, which he thrust at Miss Marple with the air of a man who has done his duty and expects to be left in peace. Miss Marple thanked him graciously, rose to leave, and allowed Gerald to escort her as far as the drive. As they walked, she remarked softly, "Your cousin seems rather nervous. I hope the country air will do her good." Gerald's smile tightened. "Sylvia has always been highly strung. Trains at night disturb her. That is all." Miss Marple thanked him again and set off down the hill. She did not look back, but she was very conscious of 3 pairs of eyes watching her from the terrace until she disappeared among the trees. Back in her own sitting room that evening, she took out her knitting and let the needles click steadily, while her thoughts moved even faster. The missing companion had been expected at Abbott's Wood, or at least known to the household. Sylvia's nervousness and Gerald's too ready charm pointed to guilty knowledge. The Colonel's irritation, whenever the railway was mentioned, was revealing, and somewhere, perhaps not far from the house, Lay the body of Harriet Stokes. Miss Marple put down her knitting for a moment and stared into the fire. Tomorrow, she said aloud to the empty room, I think it will be time to take a little walk along the footpath beside the embankment. One can learn a great deal from the state of the ground after rain. She picked up her needles again, a small, satisfied smile touching her lips. The house by the railway had told her more than its inhabitants realized. Now it was time to let the earth itself speak. Chapter 5. Tea with the Colonel. Next day dawned bright and clear, with a sharp autumn wind that sent the last brown leaves swirling across the lanes. Miss Marple rose early, breakfasted lightly, and spent the morning in her garden cutting a small bunch of late chrysanthemums. She wrapped them carefully in tissue paper, put on her best grey coat and a hat with a modest veil, and set out once more for Abbott's Wood. This time she carried no collecting list. Instead, she had in her handbag a neatly typed note from the Vicar of Melford Cross expressing thanks for any further assistance to the church roof fund. It was a harmless pretext, but one that even a reluctant host might find difficult to refuse. She arrived at the house shortly after 11. The manservant, Rogers, a quiet, middle-aged man with a sallow face and watchful eyes, opened the door. He recognized her at once and, after a moment's hesitation, showed her into the morning room, a smaller, less forbidding apartment than the drawing room she had seen on her previous visit. Colonel Harrington appeared within 5 minutes. He looked even more florid than before, as though he had not slept well. His moustache seemed to bristle with irritation. Miss Marple again, he said without preamble. I thought I made it clear yesterday that I've already given what I intend to give. Church roofs are all very well, but a man can't be expected to subsidize every tin pot appeal in the county. Miss Marple smiled apologetically and held out the vicar's note. I quite understand, Colonel. I have not come to ask for more money. The vicar merely wished me to convey his personal thanks and to ask whether you would care to see the plans for the new guttering. But since I am here, perhaps I might beg a cup of tea. The walk from the village is longer than I remembered, and the wind is quite keen. The Colonel grunted, but good breeding, or at least the remnants of it, compelled him to ring the bell. Mrs. Bryce appeared, and was instructed to bring tea for two. Sylvia and Gerald, it seemed, had gone for a walk in the woods. When the tray arrived, Miss Marple accepted her cup with murmured thanks and looked about her with gentle approval. What a charming room, she said, and such a splendid view of the garden and the valley. One can see the railway line quite clearly from here. It must be most convenient when one is expecting visitors from London. Colonel Harrington set his cup down rather sharply. Convenient? It's a confounded nuisance. The smoke, the noise, especially at night. I've half a mind to sell the place and move somewhere civilized. Yet it has its advantages, persisted Miss Marple. The halt is so close. I believe one can stop a train there by request. A most useful arrangement for anyone who wishes to alight quietly after dark without attracting attention at a larger station. The Colonel's heavy hand tightened on the arm of his chair. What exactly are you implying, madam? Nothing at all, said Miss Marple innocently, merely remarking on the geography. I noticed yesterday how the two main lines run parallel for a short distance just below your garden. It must create quite a striking effect when the trains pass one another after nightfall. All those lighted windows sliding past like magic lanterns. Colonel Harrington rose abruptly and walked to the window, standing with his back to her. His shoulders were rigid. I don't concern myself with trains, Miss Marple. I have more important matters to occupy my mind. Of course, she agreed soothingly. Family responsibilities, for instance. Your nephew Gerald seems a most charming young man, and your niece Sylvia, such a delicate-looking girl. She must find the quiet of the country very restful after London. The Colonel turned round. His face had darkened. Sylvia is highly strung. Always has been. As for Gerald, the boy has expensive tastes. London life, cards, motor cars. He expects me to finance his pleasures. And my sister-in-law, that woman Vandermeyer, sits on her money like a broody hen, refuses to help her own flesh and blood. Miss Marple took a small sip of tea. I believe Mrs. Vandermeyer's companion has been causing some anxiety. And Miss Stokes, is it not? Such an unfortunate thing when a reliable person disappears without explanation. For a moment the Colonel's eyes met hers, and Miss Marple saw something cold and calculating behind the bluster. Then he laughed shortly. Women like that are always disappearing. Probably run off with some man. Nothing to do with me. At that moment the door opened and Gerald Harrington entered, followed by Sylvia. Both looked wind-blown from their walk. Gerald's smile appeared instantly, smooth and automatic. "Why, Miss Marple, what a pleasant surprise. Uncle, you should have told us we had a visitor. We could have offered to show Miss Marple the rose garden." "The roses are nearly over," said Sylvia in a low voice. She did not look at Miss Marple directly. Her hands, Miss Marple noticed, were trembling slightly as she removed her gloves. "Nevertheless, the view from the terrace is still delightful," said Miss Marple. "Might I trouble you to show me before I leave? I am particularly interested in the way the garden slopes down towards the embankment." Gerald hesitated for the fraction of a second, then offered his arm with elaborate gallantry. "Of course. Come along, Sylvia. The fresh air will do you good." The four of them stepped out onto the terrace. The wind had dropped, and the afternoon sun lay golden on the lawns. Below them the railway cutting fell away sharply, the twin lines gleaming in the light. A goods train rumbled past, sending a plume of smoke drifting upwards. Miss Marple stood at the low stone balustrade, apparently admiring the prospect. "How very steep the embankment is," she observed. "One could easily lose one's footing in the dark, especially if one were carrying something heavy." Sylvia gave a small, choked sound and turned away. Gerald's hand closed tightly on Miss Marple's elbow, as though to steady her, or perhaps to warn her. "Careful, Miss Marple," he said lightly. "The drop is quite dangerous in places. We don't want any accidents." Colonel Harrington, who had followed them out, cleared his throat noisily. "Time you were going, Miss Marple. Rogers will see you to the gate." Miss Marple thanked them all with her sweetest smile, and allowed herself to be escorted down the drive by the silent manservant. As they walked, Rogers kept his eyes on the gravel path. "A fine property," remarked Miss Marple. "You must have been with the Colonel a long time." "Rogers, 15 years, madam," he replied without expression. "Such loyalty is rare nowadays. I expect the Colonel remembers faithful service in his will." Rogers' step faltered for an instant. "I couldn't say, madam." Miss Marple said no more. At the gate she thanked him and set off down the hill at a steady pace. She did not look back, but she knew that Rogers remained watching until she was out of sight. That evening, after a light supper, Miss Marple sat by her fire and took up her knitting. The pale blue shawl was growing steadily. Click click went the needles, steady and rhythmic, while her thoughts moved in quite another direction. Colonel Harrington had been on the defensive from the first mention of the railway. Gerald was too smooth, too quick to deflect suspicion. Sylvia was clearly terrified, and Rogers, quiet, watchful Rogers, had shown a momentary unease at the word will. She laid the knitting aside for a moment and picked up Raymond's letter again, reading the paragraph about the new will, in which Miss Stokes was mentioned more generously. "Greed," murmured Miss Marple to the fire. "Such an ugly motive, and yet so very common. And when combined with a violent temper and the convenient proximity of a lonely stretch of railway line." She took up her needles once more. Tomorrow she would write another letter, this time to Sergeant Lake. But first she needed one more small piece of evidence. The ground near the embankment had been soft after the recent rain. A short walk along the public footpath that ran parallel to the railway proved most illuminating. Miss Marple smiled gently into the firelight. Tea with the Colonel had been most informative. The pieces were beginning to fit together with the neatness of a well-made patchwork quilt, and when the final pattern emerged, she had no doubt that it would reveal a very ugly picture indeed. Chapter 6. Shadows lengthened morning. Her second visit to Abbott's Wood. Miss Marple rose with the first light and dressed with particular care. She chose stout walking shoes and a serviceable tweed coat, and slipped a small trowel, borrowed from her own potting shed, into the capacious pocket of her skirt. The post brought another letter from Raymond West, but she set it aside and opened. There would be time enough for that later. First she must see with her own eyes what the earth might tell her. Breakfast was eaten quickly, boiled egg and a slice of toast, and by 9:30 she was walking along the narrow public footpath that skirted the bottom of the railway embankment below Abbott's Wood. The path was little used except by occasional ramblers and farm labourers. On either side rose the steep grassy bank, crowned here and there with bushes of hawthorn and bramble. The recent rains had left the ground soft and yielding. Footprints showed clearly where anyone had stepped off the path. Miss Marple moved slowly, her sharp blue eyes scanning the slope above her. She had calculated the exact spot where the two trains would have run closest together on the night in question. A clump of elder bushes, thicker than the rest, caught her attention. The ground beneath them looked disturbed, not by weather or animals, but by something heavier. She climbed a little way up the embankment, steadying herself with one hand against a sapling, and examined the spot more closely. There were marks of heavy boots, and beside them the faint imprint of something that might have been the heel of a woman's shoe. The soil had been turned over and then roughly patted back. A few broken twigs lay scattered about, and one small fragment of brown fur had caught on a bramble thorn. Miss Marple detached it carefully with her handkerchief and slipped it into her pocket. She was stooping to take a small sample of the disturbed earth when a voice hailed her sharply from above. "What the devil are you doing down there, madam?" Colonel Harrington stood on the terrace of his house, binoculars in hand. Even at that distance his face was dark with anger. Gerald appeared beside him, and a moment later Sylvia, pale and clutching the balustrade. Miss Marple straightened up, brushed a little soil from her gloves, and called back in her mildest tones, "Merely taking a constitutional, Colonel. The footpath is a public right-of-way, I believe. Such a pretty view of the woods in this light." The Colonel muttered something unintelligible and disappeared indoors. Gerald, however, came hurrying down the garden steps and along the path until he reached the spot where Miss Marple stood. "You really shouldn't wander about alone on these embankments, Miss Marple," he said, his smile rather forced. "The ground is treacherous after rain. One might easily slip and hurt oneself." "How kind of you to be concerned," replied Miss Marple, "but I am quite steady on my feet, I assure you. I was only admiring the elder bushes. They have such beautiful berries at this time of year." Gerald's eyes flicked to the disturbed patch of earth. "Yes, well, perhaps you had better come up to the house for a moment. My uncle wishes to speak to you." Miss Marple allowed herself to be escorted up the slope and onto the terrace. Colonel Harrington was waiting, his hands clasped behind his back, his moustache quivering with suppressed fury. "I'll thank you to keep off my land, Miss Marple," he barked. "This is private property above the embankment. If you have nothing better to do than poke about in other people's gardens, I suggest you return to your knitting in Melford Cross." Miss Marple regarded him calmly. "I was not on your land, Colonel. The footpath is public, but I quite understand your annoyance. One does dislike strangers trampling about near one's house, especially when there may be something one does not wish them to see." Sylvia gave a faint gasp and turned away. Gerald laid a restraining hand on his uncle's arm. "Uncle, Miss Marple is an elderly lady. She means no harm, no harm," exploded the Colonel. "She's been snooping ever since she first set foot here, asking questions about trains, about missing women. I won't have it. Do you hear? I won't have it." Miss Marple smiled gently. "How very distressing for you all, especially for poor Miss Sylvia, who looks quite unwell. Perhaps a sleeping draught would help her rest. I understand such things are very effective when one has had a shock." Sylvia's face lost what little colour it possessed. She swayed slightly, and Gerald caught her elbow. "I think you had better leave now, Miss Marple," he said, his voice no longer quite so charming. "Certainly," said Miss Marple. "I have seen all I needed to see. Good morning to you." She walked back down the drive with her usual dignified step, conscious that 3 pairs of eyes followed her until the trees hid her from view. Only when she reached the main road did she pause and draw a long, steady breath. The fragment of brown fur in her pocket felt suddenly heavy. Back in her own sitting room, just opened Raymond's second letter. It contained little new information, but one sentence stood out. Mrs. Vandermeyer has now instructed her solicitors to make further inquiries about Miss Stokes. There is talk of a substantial legacy, enough to make certain people very anxious indeed. Miss Marple laid the letter aside and telephoned the police station in Chiltern. Sergeant Lake was not on duty, but the constable who answered promised to pass on her message. She had important information concerning the disappearance of Miss Harriet Stokes, and would be grateful if Sergeant Lake could call upon her at his earliest convenience. The rest of the day passed quietly. Miss Marple knitted, wrote her short notes, and prepared a simple supper, but her mind was never still. She could see the pattern now, clear and ugly. Greed had driven the crime. Fear and temper had carried it through. The body had been dragged from the train at the little-used halt, carried up the steep embankment under cover of darkness, and hidden among the bushes where the ground was soft. The Colonel's strength would have been equal to the task. Gerald would have helped dispose of any incriminating evidence the next morning. Sylvia knew, or guessed, enough to be terrified into silence, and Rogers, the manservant, had seen or heard something that bound him to the household with a new and dangerous loyalty. When Sergeant Lake arrived shortly after 6 o'clock, looking tired and sceptical, Miss Marple received him with her usual courtesy and offered him a cup of tea. "I won't waste your time, Sergeant," she said, once he was seated. "I have been to the embankment below Abbott's Wood. There is a spot where the earth has been recently disturbed. I found this caught on a bramble." She produced a small fragment of brown fur, carefully wrapped in her handkerchief. Sergeant Lake examined it without enthusiasm. "It could be from anything, Miss Marple, a rabbit, a lady's muff, even an old coat left out in the weather. It is from the collar of the green coat worn by the woman I saw strangled," said Miss Marple quietly, "and the disturbed ground is exactly where a body might have been thrown from the path above, and then hastily covered. I would suggest, Sergeant, that you obtain the necessary authority and have that spot dug up tomorrow at first light." The sergeant rubbed his chin. "It's highly irregular. Colonel Harrington is a respected gentleman. Without stronger evidence, the evidence is there," said Miss Marple, "and if you wait much longer, it may be removed. Human nature is very predictable in these matters. When people are frightened, they make mistakes. They watch the clock. They glance at certain spots in the garden. They try too hard to appear normal." Sergeant Lake looked at the tiny piece of fur again, then at the calm, elderly face opposite him. Something in Miss Marple's quiet certainty made him hesitate. "I'll speak to the inspector," he said at last, "but I can't promise anything. That is all I ask," said Miss Marple. "Merely that you look. The truth has a way of coming to light when one knows where to dig." After the sergeant had gone, Miss Marple sat for a long time by the fire. The shadows in the room lengthened and deepened. Outside, the wind rose again, whispering through the trees and along the distant railway line. She picked up her knitting once more, but for once the needles lay idle in her lap. "Tomorrow," she murmured softly, "the shadows will lengthen no further. Tomorrow, I think, we shall see what has been hidden." Chapter 7. The body in the wood. A morning of the digging dawned cold and grey, with a thin mist clinging to the hollows and a sharp wind blowing down the valley. Miss Marple rose at 6, dressed warmly, and walked the familiar road to Abbott's Wood long before the village of Melford Cross had stirred. She carried only her umbrella, and a small basket containing a flask of hot tea and a few sandwiches. She had no intention of being sent away. Sergeant Lake had been as good as his word. When she reached the footpath below the embankment, she found two constables already at work with spades, supervised by the inspector from Chiltern and a very reluctant Sergeant Lake. Colonel Harrington stood on the terrace above, his face purple with rage, shouting orders that no one heeded. Gerald hovered near him, pale and silent. Sylvia had remained indoors, but the curtains at an upper window twitched now and then as though someone were watching anxiously. "I protest in the strongest possible terms," roared the colonel as Miss Marple approached. "This is an outrage. Harassing a retired officer in his own home on the word of a meddlesome old woman." The inspector, a quiet, middle-aged man named Marridew, remained courteous but firm. "We have received information that requires investigation, sir. If nothing is found, you will receive a full apology. In the meantime, I must ask you and your household to remain on the premises." Miss Marple stationed herself a little distance away, out of the Colonel's direct line of fire, and watched the work proceed. The constables dug carefully under the alder bushes where she had pointed out the disturbed earth. The soil came up easily, dark and damp. After 20 minutes, one of the men gave a sudden exclamation. "Sir, there's something here." The inspector moved forward quickly. Miss Marple drew a little nearer. From the shallow grave, wrapped roughly in sacking and an old army blanket, the constables lifted the body of a woman. The green coat with its brown fur collar was unmistakable even in its soiled and crumpled state. The face was badly disfigured, whether by the fall down the embankment or by some deliberate attempt to hinder identification, but the general description matched the missing companion perfectly. Height, build, the wedding ring still on the left hand. Sergeant Lake looked at Miss Marple with something like awe. "You were right," he said quietly. "God help us, you were right." Colonel Harrington had come down the garden steps, Rogers at his heels. At the sight of the body, he stopped short, his bluster dying on his lips. For a moment he looked old and shaken. "I know nothing about this," he said hoarsely. "Nothing whatever." Gerald's face had gone the colour of putty. "Uncle, perhaps we should call our solicitor." Sylvia appeared at the terrace door, took one look at the scene below, and fainted. Rogers caught her before she fell. Inspector Maridew took charge with quiet efficiency. The body was removed to the mortuary under proper supervision. Statements were taken from every member of the household. Colonel Harrington insisted he had been in London on the night of the 15th and could prove it. Gerald claimed he had been reading in his room until late. Sylvia said she had taken a strong sleeping draught and remembered nothing. Rogers maintained a stony silence except to say that he had seen nothing unusual. Miss Marple was asked to make her own statement at the house. She sat in the morning room once more, speaking clearly and without emotion. "I saw the strangling quite distinctly when the two trains ran parallel," she said. "The man was tall and powerful, with a military moustache. The woman was wearing this green coat. Later, when I visited this house, I observed that the railway line lies directly below the garden. The disturbed earth and the fragment of fur confirmed my suspicions. I am sorry to cause distress, but justice must be served." Colonel Harrington glared at her with open hatred. "You interfering old witch! You'll regret this day's work." Miss Marple looked at him sadly. "I regret many things, Colonel, but never the discovery of truth." The police remained at Abbott's Wood for several hours. When they finally left, taking the Colonel, Gerald, Sylvia, and Rogers with them for a further questioning at Chiltern Police Station, the house stood silent and empty under the grey sky. Miss Marple walked slowly home through the afternoon. The wind had dropped, and a pale sun was breaking through the clouds. She felt no triumph, only a deep, quiet sadness that such things could happen among people who appeared so ordinary. That evening Sergeant Lake called at our house to report progress. "The body has been formally identified as Harriet Stokes," he said. "The post-mortem confirms death by strangulation. Time of death fits the night of the 15th. Colonel Harrington's London alibi is shaky. The hotel porter is uncertain of the exact hour he returned. Gerald's story is full of holes. Sylvia has broken down and admitted she suspected something terrible had happened, but was too frightened to speak. Rogers has confessed that he saw the Colonel return that night with muddy boots and a torn sleeve. The Colonel had promised him £500 in his will. He kept silent." Miss Marple nodded. "As I thought, greed and fear make strange bedfellows." The Colonel lost his temper when Miss Stokes arrived unexpectedly to discuss the new will. He strangled her in the carriage when the trains ran level. Then he dragged her off at the request halt, carried her up the embankment, and hid the body. Gerald helped him the next morning. Sylvia guessed the truth and was terrified into silence. Rogers saw too much and was bribed. Sergeant Lake shook his head in wonder. "You put it all together from a single glimpse in a moving train and a scrap of fur on a bush. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Not quite, Sergeant. I put it together from years of watching human nature in a small village. People are very much the same everywhere. A violent temper, the need for money, the fear of exposure. These things follow the same pattern, whether in a great house or a cottage. One has only to observe the small signs, the way a hand trembles, the way eyes avoid a certain spot in the garden, the way someone glances at the clock when a train whistle sounds in the night. She poured the sergeant another cup of tea. Tomorrow, I think, the whole story will come out. Colonel Harrington will confess, or enough evidence will be found to convict him. The others will receive lighter punishment for their parts in the concealment. Sergeant Lake stood up to go. The inspector asked me to thank you, Miss Marple. Without your persistence this crime might never have been solved. Miss Marple shook her head. I only did what any observant person might have done. But people so seldom believe an old lady who knits and minds her own business until it is too late. When the sergeant had gone, Miss Marple sat for a long time by the fire. The body in the wood had been found. The shadows that had lengthened over Abbott's Wood were lifting at last, yet she felt no satisfaction, only a quiet melancholy for the waste of 3 lives and the ruin of a once respectable household. She took up her knitting at last. The pale blue shawl was nearly finished. Click, click went the needles in the firelight, steady and comforting. Tomorrow would bring the final explanations. Tonight she would rest, knowing that justice, though slow and gentle in its approach, had not been cheated. Chapter 8. Miss Marple explains following evening. At Miss Marple's gentle but firm suggestion, a small but significant gathering took place once more in the drawing-room at Abbott's Wood. The heavy curtains were drawn against the autumn night, and a fire burned brightly in the grate. Inspector Merridew sat in the Colonel's usual armchair, Sergeant Lake beside him with notebook ready. Colonel Eustace Harrington occupied the sofa, his face set in lines of sullen defiance. Gerald Harrington stood by the window, his charm quite gone, while Sylvia sat huddled in a corner chair, her eyes red from weeping. Rogers, the manservant, remained near the door, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. Miss Marple had been given the place of honour near the fire. She looked exactly as she always did, a neat, elderly lady in a grey dress with a lace fichu, her knitting bag resting on the floor beside her. Only the sharp intelligence in her blue eyes betrayed that this was no ordinary social call. I am only an old woman, she began in her soft, clear voice, and my ideas are old-fashioned. But one learns a great deal from living quietly in the country and observing one's neighbours. People are very much the same everywhere, you know. The same motives, greed, anger, fear, appear again and again, whether in a great house or a humble cottage. She turned her gaze first to Colonel Harrington. You were not in London on the night of the 15th, Colonel. You returned on the 9.28 slow train from London, which runs parallel with the 9.15 from Market Basing for nearly 3/4 of a mile. Just below this garden, Miss Harriet Stokes had come down unexpectedly to discuss Mrs. Vandermeyer's new will, a will in which the companion was to receive a generous legacy, far more than you or your nephew had hoped for. You met her at the little halt, perhaps by arrangement, perhaps by chance. In the carriage, when the trains ran side by side and the lighted windows made everything visible, you lost your temper. Those strong hands of yours fastened round her throat. I saw the act quite clearly from my own compartment. The Colonel's face darkened to an alarming shade. Lies, all lies. Miss Marple continued calmly, as though he had not spoken. You strangled her. Then, when your own train stopped at the request halt, a stop so seldom used at night that no one would notice, you dragged the body from the carriage and carried it up the steep embankment. You are a powerful man, Colonel, accustomed to physical effort. You hid the body among the elder bushes where the ground was soft, covered it hastily, and returned to the house. The next morning your nephew Gerald helped you make the grave more secure. You hoped the crime would never be connected with Abbott's Wood. Gerald started forward. This is monstrous. I demand. Miss Marple raised one small hand. Please, Mr. Harrington, Your part comes next. You knew what had happened. You helped conceal the body, because you, too, had much to lose if your aunt's money went elsewhere. Your expensive tastes in London, your gambling debts, all depended on keeping your uncle's favor and eventually inheriting. When I called, you tried to charm me, to make light of the trains and the missing woman, but your eyes kept returning to that particular spot on the embankment. She turned to Sylvia, her voice gentler. As for you, my dear, you knew nothing at first, but you suspected soon enough. That is why you looked so ill and started at every sound. You had taken a sleeping draught on the night in question, but you woke briefly and heard voices, or perhaps saw muddy boots in the hall. Fear kept you silent. Fear for your uncle. Fear for the family name. Fear of what might happen to you if you spoke. Sylvia covered her face with her hands and began to sob quietly. Miss Marple's eyes moved at last to the manservant, Rogers. You saw the Colonel return that night. You noticed the torn coat, the muddy boots, the look on his face. You said nothing at first because you are a loyal servant, but when the Colonel promised you a handsome legacy in his will, £500, I believe, your silence became bought. A dangerous bargain, Rogers. Murder has a way of poisoning everything it touches. Rogers stared at the carpet. I never thought, I never dreamed. Inspector Merridew leaned forward. Miss Marple, how could you be so certain of the exact spot? Miss Marple smiled faintly. Several small things, Inspector. First, the timetable showed exactly where the two trains ran parallel. Second, when I visited the house, I noticed how the garden sloped directly down to that clump of elder bushes, the most natural place to throw something one wished to hide quickly. Third, the fragment of brown fur caught on a bramble matched the collar of the missing woman's coat. And fourth, the cufflinks. She turned back to the Colonel. I saw them quite clearly in the lighted window of the other train. Silver, with a regimental crest. The same crest appears on the silver cigarette case, lying on that table beside you. Such small details, you see, but they fit together like the pieces of a puzzle. Colonel Harrington suddenly seemed to shrink. The bluster drained out of him, leaving only a tired, defeated old man. She threatened me, he said in a low, broken voice. Said the money would all go to that wretched companion, unless I stopped interfering. I lost my temper. I never meant. It happened so quickly. Then I had to hide her. I couldn't let everything be ruined. A heavy silence fell over the room. Inspector Merridew rose. Colonel Eustace Harrington, I am arresting you for the murder of Harriet Stokes. Gerald Harrington and Rogers will be charged with being accessories after the fact. Miss Sylvia Harrington will be required to give evidence, but I do not anticipate further charges against her at present. The Colonel was led away without resistance. Gerald followed, his shoulders bowed. Sylvia remained behind, still weeping, while Rogers was taken to a waiting police car. When the last of them had gone, Inspector Merridew turned to Miss Marple with genuine respect. You have done a remarkable thing, madam. Without your persistence this crime had never have been brought home to the guilty parties. May I ask how you first became involved? Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap. I simply saw what I saw, Inspector, and when nobody believed an old lady who happened to be knitting in a railway carriage, I felt it my duty to make them listen. Human nature is very consistent. Greed and a violent temper so often lead to the same sad end. One has only to watch and wait for the pattern to reveal itself. She rose slowly, picked up her knitting bag, and smiled at the two police officers. And now, if you will excuse me, I think I shall go home. It has been a tiring few days, and I should like to finish this little shawl before the weather turns really cold. Sergeant Lake escorted her to the door. Thank you, Miss Marple, he said quietly. We shan't forget this. Miss Marple patted his arm. Nonsense, my dear Sergeant. I only did what any observant person might have done. Good night. She walked down the drive and along the quiet road towards Melford Cross. The night was clear, the stars bright above the dark line of the railway. In the distance a train whistled, the last train, perhaps, from Market Basing. Miss Marple smiled to herself, a small, private smile. She had not missed the last train after all. Justice, though sometimes slow, had caught its connection in the end.